The Making of a Saint, a novel by Somerset Maugham. Youth, how beautiful is youth, but alas, elusive ever. Let him be light of heart who would be so, for there's no surety in the morrow. Introduction. These are the memoirs of the Beato Giuliano, brother of the Order of St. Francis of Assisi, known in his worldly life as Filippo Brandolini, of which family I, Giulio Brandolini, am the last descendant. On the death of Fra Giuliano, the manuscript was given to his nephew Leonello, on whom the estates devolved, and has since been handed down from father to son as the relic of a member of the family whose piety and good works still shed lustre on the name of Brandolini. It is perhaps necessary to explain how the resolution to give these memoirs to the world has eventually been arrived at. For my part, I should have allowed them to remain among the other papers of the family, but my wife wished otherwise. When she deserted her home in the New World to become the Countess Brandolini, she was very naturally interested at finding among my ancestors a man who had distinguished himself in good works, so as to be granted by the Pope the title of Beatus, which was acquired for him by the influence of his great-nephew not very long after his death. And indeed, had our house retained the prosperity which it enjoyed during the 15th and 16th centuries, he would undoubtedly have been canonized, for it was a well-certified fact that the necessary miracles had been performed by his remains and that prayers had been regularly offered at his tomb, but our estates had dwindled so that we could not afford the necessary expenditure. And now, when my wife has restored its ancient magnificence to our house, times, alas, have changed. The good old customs of our fathers have fallen into disuse, and it is impossible to create a saint for ready money. However, my wife desired to publish an account of her pious ancestor. But a difficulty arose in the fact that there were no materials whatever for any relation of the life which Fra Giuliano led when he had entered the Franciscan monastery of Campomassa, and it was obvious that, even if there had been good works, prayer and fasting could not have afforded a very interesting story. And so we have been constrained to leave untold his pieties, and recount instead his sins, for which there was every facility in the memoirs he had himself left behind him. Not content with writing the story of his own life, Fra Giuliano begins with a mythical consul of the Roman Republic, who is supposed to have founded the family by a somewhat discreditable union with somebody else's wife. He then carries the story through countless ages, till he arrives at his own conception, and the prodigies attending his birth, which he describes with great minuteness. He gives very amply the history of his childhood and boyhood, the period he spent as page at the court of the Bentivogli of Bologna, and his adventures in the Neapolitan armies under the Duke of Calabria. But the whole story is narrated at such length, with so many digressions and details, and is sometimes so vague, incoherent, and disjointed that, with whatever editing, it was considered impossible to make a clear and continuous narrative. For Giuliano himself divided his life into two parts, the one he named the time of honey, being the period of expectation, the other the time of gall, being that of realization. The second half commences with his arrival at the town of Forlì in the year 1488, and it is this part which we have decided to publish, for, notwithstanding its brevity, this was the most eventful period of his life, and the account of it seems to hang together in a sufficiently lucid fashion, centering round the conspiracy which resulted in the assassination of Girolamo Riario, and finishing with the author's admission to the Order of St. Francis. This, then, I have given exactly as he wrote it, neither adding nor suppressing a word. I do not deny that it would have pleased me a little to falsify the history, for the Anglo-Saxons are a race of idealists, as is shown in all their dealing, international and commercial, and truth they have always found a little ugly. I have a friend who lately wrote a story of the London poor, and his critics were properly disgusted because his characters dropped their H's and often used bad language and did not behave as elegantly as might be expected from the example they were continually receiving from their betters. While some of his readers were shocked to find that people existed in this world who did not possess the delicacy and refinement which they felt palpitating in their own bosoms. The author forgot that truth is a naked lady, and that nudity is always shameful unless it points a moral. If truth has taken up her abode at the bottom of a well, it is clearly because she is conscious that she is no fit companion for decent people. I am painfully aware that the persons of this drama were not actuated by the moral sentiments, which they might have acquired by education at a really good English public school, but one may find excuse for them in the recollection that their deeds took place 400 years ago, and that they were not wretched paupers, but persons of the very highest rank. If they sinned elegantly, and much may be forgiven to people whose pedigree is above suspicion. And the writer, as if unwilling to wound the susceptibilities of his readers, has taken care to hurl contempt at the only character whose family was distinctly not respectable. Before making my bow and leaving the reader with Filippo Brandolini, I will describe his appearance shown in a portrait painted in the same year, 1488, until the beginning of this century in the possession of my family, when it was sold, with many other works of art, to travellers in Italy. My wife has succeeded in buying back the portraits of several of my ancestors, but this particular one is in the collection of an English nobleman who has refused to part with it, though kindly allowing a copy to be made, which now hangs in the place formerly occupied by the original. It represents a middle-sized man, slim and graceful, with a small black beard and moustache, an oval face, olive-colored, and from his fine dark eyes he is looking straight out into the world with an expression of complete happiness. It was painted soon after his marriage. He is dressed in the costume of the period and holds a roll of parchment in his hand. At the top right-hand corner are the date and the arms of the family, or a griffin rampant, gules crest, a demiswan issuing from a coronet. The motto, Felicitas. Allow me to present to you my friend, Filippo Brandolini, a gentleman of Città di Castello. Then, turning to me, Matteo added, This is my cousin, Cecco d'Orsi. Cecco d'Orsi smiled and bowed. Messer Brandolini, he said, I am most pleased to make your acquaintance. You are more than welcome to my house. You are very kind, I replied. Matteo has told me much of your hospitality. Cecco bowed courteously and asked his cousin, You have just arrived, Matteo? We arrived early this morning. I wished to come here directly, but Filippo, who suffers from a very insufferable vanity, insisted on going to an inn and spending a couple of hours in the adornment of his person. How did you employ those hours, Matteo? Asked Cecco, looking rather questioningly at his cousin's dress and smiling. Matteo looked at his boots and his coat. I am not elegant, but I felt too sentimental to attend to my personal appearance, and I had to restore myself with wine. You know, we are very proud of our native Forli wine, Filippo. I did not think you were in the habit of being sentimental, Matteo, remarked Cecco. It was quite terrifying this morning when we arrived, said I. He struck attitudes and called it his beloved country, and wanted to linger in the cold morning and tell me anecdotes about his childhood. You professional sentimentalists will never let anyone sentimentalize but yourselves. I was hungry, said I, laughing, and it didn't become you. Even your horse had his doubts. Brute, said Matteo. Of course, I was too excited to attend to my horse, and he slipped over those confounded stones and nearly shot me off, and Filippo, instead of sympathizing, burst out laughing. Evidently you must abandon sentiment, said Cecco. I'm afraid you are right. Now Filippo can be romantic for hours at a stretch, and what is worse, he is. But nothing happens to him. but on coming back to my native town after 4 years, I think it was pardonable. We accept your apology, Matteo, I said. But the fact is, Cecco, that I am glad to get back. The sight of the old streets, the palazzo, all fill me with a curious sensation of joy, and I don't know how I feel. Make the utmost of your pleasure while you can. You may not always find a welcome in Forlì, said Cecco gravely. What the devil do you mean? Asked Matteo. Oh, we'll talk of these things later. You had better go and see my father now, and then you can rest yourselves. You must be tired after your journey. Tonight, we have here a great gathering where you will meet your old friends. The Count has deigned to accept my invitation. Deigned, said Matteo, lifting his eyebrows and looking at his cousin. Cecco smiled bitterly. Times have changed since you were here, Matteo, he said. The Forlivesi are subjects and courtiers now. Putting aside Matteo's further questions, he bowed to me and left us. I wonder what it is, said Matteo. What did you think of him? I had examined Cecco d'Orsi curiously. A tall, dark man with full beard and moustache, apparently about 40. There was a distinct likeness between him and Matteo. They both had the same dark hair and eyes, but Matteo's face was broader, the bones more prominent, and the skin rougher from his soldier's life. Cecco was thinner and graver. He looked a great deal more talented. Matteo, as I often told him, was not clever. He was very amiable, I said, in reply to the question. A little haughty, but he means to be courteous. He is rather oppressed with his dignity of head of the family. But his father is still alive. Yes, but he's 85, and he's as deaf as a post and as blind as a bat, so he remains quietly in his room while Cecco pulls the strings so that we poor devils have to knuckle under and do as he bids us. I'm sure that must be very good for you, I said. I'm curious to know why Cecco talks of the Count as he did. When I was here last, they were bosom friends. However, let us go and drink, having done our duty. We went to the inn at which we had left our horses and ordered wine. Give us your best, my fat friend, cried Matteo to mine host. This gentleman is a stranger and does not know what wine is. He was brought up on the sickly juice of Città di Castello. You live at Città di Castello? Asked the innkeeper. I wish I did, I answered. He was ejected from his country for his country's good, remarked Matteo. That is not true, I replied, laughing. I left of my own free will. Galloping as hard as you could, with 24 horsemen at your heels. Precisely, and so little did they want me to go, that when I thought a change of air would suit me, they sent a troop of horse to induce me to return. Your head would have made a pretty ornament stuck on a pike in the Grand Piazza. The thought amuses you, I answered, but the comedy of it did not impress me at the time. I remembered the occasion when news was brought me that the Vitelli, the tyrant of Castello, had signed a warrant for my arrest. Whereupon, knowing the rapid way he had of dealing with his enemies, I had bidden farewell to my hearth and home with somewhat indecent haste. But the old man had lately died, and his son, proceeding to undo all his father's deeds, had called back the fuorusciti, and strung up from the palace windows such of his father's friends as had not had time to escape. I had come to Forlì with Matteo, on my way home to take possession of my confiscated property, hoping to find that the intermediate proprietor, who was dangling at a rope's end some 100 feet from the ground, had made sundry necessary improvements. Well, what do you think of our wine? Said Matteo. Compare it with that of Città di Castello. I really haven't tasted it yet, I said, pretending to smile agreeably. Strange wines I always drink at a gulp, like medicine. Bruta bestia, said Matteo. You are no judge. It's possible, I said, laughing, having sipped it with great deliberation. Matteo shrugged his shoulders. These foreigners, he said scornfully. Come here, fat man, he called to the innkeeper. Tell me how Count Girolamo and the gracious Caterina are progressing. When I left Forlì, the common people struggled to lick the ground they trod on. The innkeeper shrugged his shoulders. Gentlemen of my profession have to be careful in what they say. Don't be a fool, man. I am not a spy. Well, sir, the common people no longer struggle to lick the ground the Count treads on. I see. You understand, sir, now that his father is dead? When I was here last, Sixtus was called his uncle. Ah, they say he was too fond of him not to be his father, but of course I know nothing. Far be it from me to say anything in disparagement of his holiness, past or present. However, go on. Well, sir, when the Pope died, the Count Girolamo found himself short of money, and so the taxes that he had taken off he put on again. And the result is, well, the people are beginning to murmur about his extravagance, and they say that Caterina behaves as if she were a queen, whereas we all know that she is only the bastard of old Sforza of Milan. But of course, it has nothing to do with me. Matteo and I were beginning to feel sleepy, for we had been riding hard all night, and we went upstairs, giving orders to be called in time for the night's festivity. We were soon fast asleep. In the evening, Matteo came to me and began examining my clothes. I have been considering, Filippo, he said, that it behoves me, on my first appearance, before the eyes of my numerous lady, loves to cut the best figure I can. I quite agree with you, I answered, but I don't see what you're doing with my clothes. Nobody knows you, and it is unimportant how you look, and as you have some very nice things here, I am going to take advantage of your kindness and— You're not going to take my clothes, I said, springing out of bed. Matteo gathered up in his arms various garments and rushed out of the room, slamming the door and locking it on the outside so that I was left shut in, helpless. I shouted abuse after him, but he went away laughing, and I had to manage as best I could with what he had left me. In half an hour, he came to the door. "Do you want to come out?" he said. "Of course I do," I answered, kicking the panel. "Will you promise not to be violent?" I hesitated. "I shan't let you out unless you do." "Very well," I answered, laughing. Matteo opened the door and stood bolt upright on the threshold, decked out from head to foot in my newest clothes. "You villain," I said, amazed at his effrontery. "You don't look bad, considering," he answered, looking at me calmly. 2. When we arrived at the Palazzo Orsi, many of the guests had already come. Matteo was immediately surrounded by his friends, and a score of ladies beckoned to him from different parts of the room, so that he was torn away from me, leaving me rather disconsolate alone in the crowd. Presently, I was attracted to a group of men talking to a woman whom I could not see. Matteo had joined them, and they were laughing at something he had said. I had turned away to look at other people when I heard Matteo calling me. "Filippo," he said, coming towards me, "come and be introduced to Donna Giulia. She has asked me to present you." He took me by the arm, and I saw that the lady and her admirers were looking at me. "She's no better than she should be," he whispered in my ear, "but she's the loveliest woman in Forlì." "Allow me to add another to your circle of adorers, Donna Giulia," said Matteo, as we both bowed. "Messer Filippo Brandolini, like myself, a soldier of distinction." I saw a graceful little woman dressed in some oriental brocade. A small face with quite tiny features, large brown eyes, which struck me at the first glance as very soft and caressing, a mass of dark, reddish-brown hair, and a fascinating smile. "We were asking Matteo where his wounds were," she said, smiling on me very graciously. "He tells us they are all in the region of his heart." "In that case," I answered, "he has come to a more deadly battlefield than any we saw during the war." "What war?" asked a gentleman who was standing by. "Nowadays, we are in the happy state of having 10 different wars in as many parts of the country." I was serving under the Duke of Calabria, I replied. In that case, your battles were bloodless. We came, we saw, and the enemy decamped, said Matteo. And now, taking advantage of the peace, you have come to trouble the hearts of Forli, said Donna Giulia. Who knows how useful your swords may not be here, remarked a young man. Be quiet, Niccolo, said another. And there was an awkward silence, during which Matteo and I looked at one another in surprise. And then everyone burst out talking, so that you could not hear what was said. Matteo and I bowed ourselves away from Donna Giulia, and he took me to Cecco, standing in a group of men. You have recovered from your fatigue? He asked kindly. You have been traveling, Matteo, said one of the company. Yes, we rode 60 miles yesterday, he replied. 60 miles on one horse? You must have good steeds and good imaginations, said a big, heavy-looking man, an ugly, sallow-faced person whom I hated at first sight. It was only once in a way, and we wanted to get home. You could not have come faster if you had been running away from a battlefield, said the man. I thought him needlessly disagreeable, but I did not speak. Matteo had not cultivated the golden quality. You talk as one who has had experience, he remarked, smiling in his most amiable manner. I saw Cecco frown at Matteo, while the bystanders looked on interestedly. I only said that, added the man, shrugging his shoulders, because the Duke of Calabria is rather celebrated for his retreative tactics. I entertained a very great respect for the Duke, who had always been a kind and generous master to me. Perhaps you do not know very much about tactics, I remarked as offensively as I could. He turned and looked at me as if to say, Who the devil are you? He looked me up and down contemptuously, and I began to feel that I was almost losing my temper. My good young man, he said, I imagine that I was engaged in war when your battles were with your nursemaid. You have the advantage of me in courtesy as well as in years, sir, I replied. But I might suggest that a man may fight all his life and have no more idea of war at the end than at the beginning. It depends on the intelligence, remarked Matteo. Exactly what I was thinking, said I. What the devil do you mean? Said the man angrily. I don't suppose he means anything at all, Ercole, put in Cecco with a forced laugh. He can answer for himself, I suppose, said the man. A flush came over Cecco's face, but he did not answer. My good sir, I said, you have to consider whether I choose to answer. Jacanapes! I put my hand to my sword, but Cecco caught hold of my arm. I recovered myself at once. I beg your pardon, Messer Cecco, I said. Then, turning to the man, you are safe in insulting me here. You show your breeding. Really, Matteo, you did not tell me that you had such a charming fellow countryman. You are too hard on us, Filippo, answered my friend, for such a monstrosity as that Forli is not responsible. I am no Forlivese, thank God, neither the Count nor I. He looked round scornfully. We offer up thanks to the Almighty every time the fact occurs to us. I am a citizen of Castello. Matteo was going to burst out, but I anticipated him. I, too, am a citizen of Castello, and allow me to inform you that I consider you a very insolent fellow, and I apologize to these gentlemen that a countryman of mine should forget the courtesy due to the city which is sheltering him. You are Castellese, and pray who are you? My name is Filippo Brandolini. I know your house. Mine is Ercole Piacentini. I cannot return the compliment. I have never heard of yours. The surrounders laughed. My family is as good as yours, sir, he said. Really, I have no acquaintance with the middle classes of Castello, but I have no doubt it is respectable. I noticed that the listeners seemed very contented, and I judged that Messer Ercole Piacentini was not greatly loved in Forli, but Cecco was looking on anxiously. You insolent young boy, said the man furiously. How dare you talk to me like that? I will kick you. I put my hand to my sword to draw it, for I was furious too. I pulled at the hilt, but I felt a hand catch hold of mine and prevent me. I struggled. Then I heard Cecco in my ear. "Don't be a fool," he said. "Be quiet." "Let me be," I cried. "Don't be a fool. You'll ruin us." He held my sword so that I could not draw it. Ercole saw what was going on. His lips broke into a sarcastic smile. "You are being taught the useful lesson of discretion, young man. You are not the only one who has learnt it." He looked round at the bystanders. At that moment a servant came to Cecco and announced, "The Count." The group broke up, and Cecco advanced to the further end of the hall with Ercole Piacentini and several other gentlemen. Matteo and I lingered where we were. There was a rustle, and the Count and Countess appeared attended by their suite. First of all, my eyes were attracted to Caterina. She was wonderfully beautiful. A tall, well-made woman holding herself proudly, her head poised on the neck like a statue. "One would think she was a king's daughter," said Matteo, looking at her with astonishment. "It is almost Francesco's face," I said. We both had an immense admiration for Francesco Sforza, the king of Condottieri, who had raised himself from a soldier of fortune to the proudest duchy in the world. And Caterina, his natural daughter, had the same clear, strong features, the strong, piercing eyes. But instead of the Sforza's pockmarked skin, she had a complexion of rare delicacy and softness, and afterwards she proved that she had inherited her father's courage as well as his appearance. She was dressed in a gorgeous robe of silver cloth, glittering and shimmering as she walked, and her hair was done in her favorite manner, intertwined with gold and silver threads. But the wonderful chestnut outshone the brilliant metals, seeming to lend them beauty rather than to borrow it. I heard her speak, and her voice was low and full like a man's. Matteo and I stood looking at her for a minute. Then we both broke out, "Per Bacco, she is beautiful." I began thinking of the fairy stories I had heard of Caterina at Rome, where she had enchanted everyone by her loveliness. And Sixtus had squandered the riches of the church to satisfy her whims and fancies, banquets, balls, pageants, and gorgeous ceremonies. The ancient city had run red with wine and mad with delight of her beauty. Suddenly Matteo said to me, "Look at Girolamo." I lifted my eyes and saw him standing quite close to me, a tall man, muscular and strong, with big heavy face and prominent jawbones, the nose long and hooked, small keen eyes, very mobile. His skin was unpleasant, red and coarse. Like his wife, he was dressed with great magnificence. "One sees the sailor grandfather in him," I said, remembering that Sixtus's father, the founder of the family, was a common sailor at Rovese. He was talking to Cecco, who was apparently speaking to him of us, for he turned and stepped forward to Matteo. "The prodigal has returned," he said. "We will not fail to kill the fatted calf. But this time you must stay with us, Matteo. We can give you service as well as the Duke of Calabria." Matteo smiled grimly, and the Count turned to me. "Cecco has told me of you also, sir, but I fear there is no chance of keeping you. You are but a bird of passage. Still, I hope you will let us make you welcome at the palace." All the time he was speaking, his eyes kept moving rapidly up and down, all round me, and I felt he was taking in my whole person. After these few words, he smiled, a harsh, mechanical smile, meant to be gracious, and with a courteous bow moved on. I turned to Matteo and saw him looking after the Count very sourly. "What is it?" I asked. "He is devilish condescending," he answered. "When last I was here it was hail fellow, well met, but good God, he's put on airs since then." "Your cousin said something to the same effect," I remarked. "Yes, I understand what he meant now." We strolled round the room, looking at the people and talking. "Look," I said, "there's a handsome woman, pointing to a voluptuous beauty, a massive creature, full-breasted and high-colored. "Your eye is drawn to a handsome woman like steel to a magnet, Filippo," answered Matteo, laughing. "Introduce me," I said, "if she is not ferocious." "By no means, and she has probably already fixed her eyes upon you, but she is wife to Ercole Piacentini." "I don't care. I mean to kill the man afterwards, but that is no reason why I should not make myself pleasant to his spouse." "You will do her a service in both ways," he replied, and going up to her, "Claudia," he said, "your fatal eyes have transfixed another heart." Her sensual lips broke into a smile. "Have they that power?" She fixed them on me and made room on the couch on which she was sitting. Neither Matteo nor I were slow to take the hint, for I took my place and he his leave. "I wonder you have not already fallen victim to Madonna Julia," said Claudia, looking languorously at me and glancing over to the other lady. "One does not worship the moon when the sun is shining," I replied politely. "Julia is more like the sun, for she gathers all men in her embrace. I am more modest." I understood that the rival beauties were not good friends. "You boast that you are cruel," I replied. She did not answer, but sighed deeply, smiling, and fixed on me her great, liquid eyes. "Oh, there is my husband." I looked up and saw the great Ercole glaring viciously at me. I laughed within myself. "He must be very jealous of so beautiful a wife?" I asked. "He torments me to death." Under these circumstances, I thought I would pursue my advantage. I pressed closer to her. "I can understand it. The first moment I saw you, I felt my head whirl." She gave me a very long glance from beneath her eyelashes. I seized her hand. "Those eyes," I said, looking into them fervently. "Ah!" she sighed again. "Madam," said a page boy, coming up to her, "Messer Piacentini begs that you will come to him." She gave a little cry of annoyance. "My husband!" Then, rising from her seat, she turned to me, holding out her hand. I immediately offered my arm, and we solemnly crossed the room to Ercole Piacentini. Here she bowed very graciously to me, and I smiled on the happy husband with the utmost sweetness, while he looked very grim and took not the faintest notice of me. Then I marched off, feeling particularly pleased with myself. The Count and Countess were on the point of taking their departure. They were followed by Ercole and his wife. The remaining guests soon went, and in a little while there were left only Matteo and myself, 2 other men, and Cecco. "Sir." Cecco led us to a smaller room, at some distance from the great hall of the reception. Then, turning to a man I did not know, he said, "Did you hear the Piacentini?" "Yes," he answered, and for a moment they looked at one another silently. "He would not have been so bold without good cause," added the man. "I was told that his name was Lodovico Pansecchi, and that he was a soldier in the Count's pay." Cecco turned round and looked at me sharply. Matteo understood what he meant and said, "Have no fear of Filippo. He is as safe as myself." Cecco nodded and made a sign to a youth who immediately rose and carefully closed the door. We sat still for a while. Then Cecco stood up and said impatiently, "I cannot understand it." He walked up and down the room, stopping at last in front of me. "You had never seen that man before?" "Never," I answered. "The quarrel was brought on solely by Ercole himself," said the youth, whom I found to be Alessandro Moratini, a brother of Giulia dal Este. "I know," said Cecco, "but he would never have dared to behave thus unless he knew of some design of Girolamo." He paused a moment to think, then turning to me again, "You must not challenge him." "On the contrary," I replied, "I must challenge him. He has insulted me." "I don't care about that. I will not have you challenge him. This concerns myself alone." "Nonsense. You are a guest of my house, and for all I know, it is just such an opportunity as this that Girolamo is seeking." "I don't understand," I said. "Listen," said Cecco, sitting down again. "When Sixtus obtained possession of Forli for his nephew Girolamo Riario, I, like the fool I was, did all I could to bring the town to his allegiance. My father was against the plan, but I bore down his opposition and threw the whole power of my house on his side. Without me, he would never have been Lord of Forli." "I remember," said Matteo. "You used Sixtus to keep the Ordelaffi out, and you thought Girolamo would be a catspaw in our hands." "I did not give the city for love of a person I had never seen in my life. Well, this was 8 years ago. Girolamo took off the heaviest taxes, granted favors to the town, and entered in solemn state with Caterina." "Amid shouts and cheers," remarked Alessandro. "For a while, he was more popular than ever the Ordelaffi had been, and when he went out, the people ran to kiss the hem of his garment. He spent the great part of his time in Rome, but he employed the riches of the Pope in beautifying Forli, and when he came, it was one round of feasts and balls and gaiety. Then Pope Sixtus died, and Girolamo settled here for good in the palace which he had commenced building on his accession. The feasts and balls and gaiety continued. Whenever a distinguished stranger passed through the town, he was welcomed by the Count and his wife with the most lavish hospitality, so that Forli became renowned for its luxury and riches. The poets ransacked Parnassus and the ancients for praises of their rules, and the people echoed the panegyrics of the poet. Then came the crash. I had often warned Girolamo, for we were intimate friends then. I told him that he could not continue the splendor which he had used when the wealth of Christendom was at his command, when he could spend the tribute of a nation on a necklace for Caterina. He would not listen. It was always, "I cannot be mean and thrifty," and he called it policy. To be popular, he said, I must be magnificent. The time came when the treasury was empty, and he had to borrow. He borrowed in Rome and Florence and Milan, and all the time he would not retrench, but rather, as his means became less, the extravagance became greater. But when he could borrow no more outside, he came to the citizens of Forli, first, of course, to me, and I repeatedly lent him large sums. These were not enough, and he sent for the richest men of Forli and asked them to lend him money. Naturally, they could not refuse. But he squandered their money as he had squandered his own, and one fine day he assembled the council. "Ah, yes," said Alessandro. "I was there then. I heard him speak." Cecco stopped, as if for Alessandro. He came to the council chamber, clad as usual in the richest robes, and began talking privately to the senators, very courteously, laughing with them, shaking their hands. Then, going to his place, he began to speak. He talked of his liberality towards them and the benefits he had conferred on the town, showed them his present necessities, and finally asked them to reimpose the taxes which he had taken off at the beginning of his reign. They were all prejudiced against him, for many of them had already lent him money privately. But there was such a charm in his discourse, he was so persuasive, that one really could not help seeing the reasonableness of his demand. I know I myself would have granted him whatever he asked. "He can make one do anything he likes when he once begins talking," said Lodovico. The council unanimously voted the reimposition of the taxes, and Girolamo offered them his thanks in his most gracious manner. There was a silence, broken by Matteo. "And then?" he asked. "Then," answered Cecco, "he went to Imola and commenced spending there the money that he was gathering here." "And what did they think of it in Forli?" "Ah, when the time came to pay the taxes, they ceased their praises of Girolamo. First they murmured beneath their breath, then out loud, and soon they cursed him and his wife. The Count heard of it and came back from Imola, thinking, by his presence, to preserve the town in its allegiance. But the fool did not know that the sight of him would redouble the anger of the populace. They saw his gorgeous costumes, the gold and silver dresses of his wife, the jewels, the feasting and riotry, and they knew that it came out of their pockets. The food of their children, all that they had toiled and worked for, was spent on the insane luxury of this papal favorite and his bastard wife. "And how has he treated us?" cried Lodovico, beating his fist violently down on the table. "I was in the pay of the Duke of Calabria, and he made me tempting offers, so that I left the armies of Naples to enter the papal service under him. And now, for 4 years, I have not received a penny of my salary, and when I ask him, he puts me aside with gentle words, and now he does not even trouble to give me them. A few days back, I stopped him in the piazza and, falling on my knees, begged for what he owed me. He threw me violently away and said he could not pay me, and the jewel on his breast was worth 10 times the money he owed me. And now he looks at me with frowns, me who have served him faithfully as a dog. I will not endure it. By God, I will not." He clenched his fists as he spoke, trembling with rage. "And you know how he has served me," said Cecco. "I have lent him so much that he has not the face to ask for more, and how do you think he has rewarded me? Because I have not paid certain dues I owe the treasury, he sent a sheriff to demand them, and when I said I would not pay them at that moment, he sent for me and himself asked for the money. What did you do? I reminded him of the money he owed me, and he informed me that a private debt had nothing to do with a debt to the state, and said that I must pay or the law should take its course." "He must be mad," said Matteo. "He is mad, mad with pride, mad in his extravagance." "I tell you," said Lodovico, "it cannot be endured." "And they tell me that he has said my tongue must be silenced," added Cecco. "The other day he was talking to Giuseppe Albicina, and he said, 'Let Cecco beware. He may go too far and find the hand of the master not so gentle as the hand of the friend.'" "I too have heard him say things which sounded like threats," said Alessandro. "We have all heard it," added Lodovico. "When his temper overcomes him, he cares not what he says, and one discovers then what he and his silent wife have been plotting between them." "Now, sir," interrupted Cecco, speaking to me, "you see how things stand. We are on thin ground, and the fire is raging beneath us. You must promise not to seek further quarrel with this countryman of yours, this Ercole Piacentini. He is one of Girolamo's chiefest favorites, and he would not bear to see him touched. If you happen to kill him, the Count would take the opportunity to have us all arrested, and we should suffer the fate of the Pazzi at Florence. Will you promise?" "I promise," I answered, smiling, "to defer my satisfaction to a fitter opportunity." "Now, gentlemen," said Cecco, "we can separate." We bade one another good night. Alessandro, as he was going, said to Matteo, "You must bring your friend to my sister tomorrow. She will be glad to see you both." We said we should be enchanted, and Alessandro and Lodovico Pansecchi left us. Matteo looked at Cecco meditatively. "Cousin," he said, "all this looks very like conspiracy." Cecco started. "I cannot help it, if the people are dissatisfied with Girolamo." "But you," pursued Matteo, "I imagine you do not greatly care whether the people are taxed or no. You knew the taxes would have to come on again sooner or later. Has he not insulted me by sending a sheriff to demand his dues?" "Is there nothing further than that?" asked Matteo, looking at his cousin steadily. Cecco lifted his eyes and gazed back into Matteo's. "Yes," he said at last. 8 years ago I was Girolamo's equal. Now I am his servant. I was his friend. He loved me like a brother. And then his wife came, the daughter of Francesco Sforza, the bastard. And gradually he has lifted himself up from me. He has been cold and reserved. He begins to show himself master. and now I am nothing more than a citizen among citizens, the first, but not the equal of the master." Cecco kept silence for a moment, and in his quietness, I could see the violence of his emotion. "This concerns you as well as me, Matteo. You are an Orsi, and the Orsi are not made to be servants. I will be no man's servant. When I think of this man, this bastard of a pope, treating me as beneath him, by God, I cannot breathe. I could roll on the floor and tear my hair with rage. Do you know that the Orsi have been great and rich for 300 years? The Medici pale before them, for they are burghers, and we have been always noble. We expelled the Ordelaffi because they wished to give us a bastard boy to rule over us, and shall we accept this Riario? I swear I will not endure it." "Well said," said Matteo. "Girolamo shall go as the Ordelaffi went. By God, I swear it." I looked at Matteo, and I saw that suddenly a passion had caught hold of him. His face was red, his eyes staring wide, and his voice was hoarse and thick. "But do not mistake again, Cecco," he said. "We want no foreign rulers. The Orsi must be the only lords of Forli." Cecco and Matteo stood looking at one another. Then the former, shaking himself as if to regain his calmness, turned his back on us and left the room. Matteo strode up and down for a while in thought, and then, turning to me, said, "Come." We went out and returned to our hostelry.